listening to you, I was basically represented as being the professional pessimist being Bulgarian, but listening to the conversation, I do believe that even pessimism does not work anymore. What I'll start for, I do believe that there was something very common, especially between what Lilia and Mr. Stepic said. We are in a totally new situation. And totally new situation is, in my view, characterized not by the fact that we are coming with the new answers of the old questions, but basically we're facing a totally new questions. On May 25th, we can end up with a real crisis. I was in Ukraine 3 weeks ago and I was in Russia 10 days ago. In Ukraine, everybody I talked to told me there are going to be elections in Ukraine. It was not simply the government, but Mr. Tigipko, basically some of the former Yanukovych advisors. And then I was in Russia and everybody told me that there are not going to be elections in May 25th. So from this point of view, we're talking about a period of 30 days in which we are negotiating basically not big financial packages, but basically you're negotiating how the political space is going to be arranged. I'm saying this because I very much agree with Lilia that we see the end of the post-Cold War settlement or European order. By the way, this post-Cold War European order was not born out of the collapse of the Berlin Wall. And from this point of view, I do believe where Gerald was very much right was the fact that people now try to believe that after the Berlin Wall, there was a huge waves of euphoria. It was not. It was a huge wave of uncertainty and fears. If you see the major titles that have been published and discussed then, it was The Clash of Civilization by Huntington. Brzezinski came with Out of Control. The basic story was that it was the end of an order and people basically have been much more looking about the new world disorder. The funny and important thing about 1990 was that the collapse of the Soviet Union was not assumed. I was recently basically rereading the special report that the Pentagon prepared. It was December 1990 when they claimed that the collapse of the Soviet Union is unlikely. I'm saying this because to a certain extent, this European order was very much the result of the disintegration of Yugoslavia. And from this point of view, this is quite important because both the NATO expansions and the EU expansion cannot be understood outside of the context of the Yugoslav wars. And there is an irony of history, but if you basically try to see, this order became with a disintegration of a federal communist state that was very much rooted in the Cold War type of a geopolitical status quo. And this basically order is ending with a push for violent federalization of a kind of a post-communist competitive regime in Ukraine. And from this point of view, I do believe it's quite important, at least in my view, to ask several questions. And the first question is, to what extent the enlargement is to be blamed for the current crisis? And this is very important, by the way, and I do believe that there is a lot of people outside of Russia who are going to say that if the enlargement was not there, NATO, but also the European Union, we could avoid this type of a clash. And I do believe this is an interesting argument after the enlargement has been done. Because now we assume that countries like Poland, Czech Republic, Hungary, a secure place, they're taking now for granted and part of Europe, and you can have this conversation. But if you go back to 1993, 1994, by the way, Poland economically didn't look like the graphics that we have been showing. 1993, Poland was looking like Ukraine, country in which you have a total instability, change of governments, total war on the top, and the relations between Mr. Valensa and some of his basically opponents on the level of the emotional intensity was not very different than the relations between Mr. Poroshenko and Mrs. Tymoshenko these days. I'm saying this because I do believe that after you manage to stabilize something, you start to assume stability for given. And this is why I'm not ready to blame the enlargement for the current crisis. And also I'm going to say that in a certain way, it's also slightly unfair to explain all Russia policies simply as a reaction to certain Western policies. There is a certain type of revisionism, and I have a lot of sympathy with some of the arguments that have been made. I do believe that demonizing Russian position is simply a cheap game, and now we are paying the basically the price for coming with a totally cartoon view of Russia, where all politicians are just stealing money and what to do this and that. It's slightly more complicated than this. It's slightly more complicated than this. But there are four sources of Russian revisionism which are not related to the enlargement. One is that at a certain level, the acceptance of the European order on the Russian side was basically the result of the Russia's weakness. And in international relations, we know that capabilities very much shape intentions. The new reality is Russia is stronger than it used to be, or at least it believes it's stronger than it used to be. In military terms, of course, the Crimean operation was very different than the Georgian war in 2008. The second, and I do believe Lilia very much touched on this, there is a general and genuine cultural resentment of the Russian elites to the state of Europe. It's not about ideology, and by the way, it has nothing to do with the Soviet Union. But basically for the Russian elites, Europe is perceived as a place in moral decay. The idea of the same-sex empire is not simply propaganda. I do believe from time to time everything that we don't like, we believe it's just propaganda and that the other side didn't believe it. I want to assure you that Russian leadership believes it. Also, they believe that the protests in Moscow have been inspired by the American embassy and that basically Ukraine revolution was totally sponsored from outside. I don't believe it's based on facts, but the fact is that they believe it and they're acting on their beliefs. So from this point of view, it's not some cynical people who are saying this bullshit, but they know that it's bullshit. It is what they believe in. And for me, this is very important because when we go and try to explain also the triggering of the recent Ukrainian crisis, we are telling the crisis as if it was a clash between the West and Russia only. I'm going to claim that the Ukrainian crisis was very much internal in its dynamics. It was much more about Mr. Yanukovych himself than about Russia facing the West. Go with the dynamics of the protest movement. By the way, it's not true that the mass protest started as a reaction to him not signing with the EU. The mass protest started with the fact that he decided to use force against students and middle class, because people sense this as a regime change. And it was not simply people on the street, it was also the oligarchs, because in a certain way, Ukraine was a pluralistic oligarchical regime. And what Mr. Yanukovych was offering them is to keep oligarchical, but basically to delete pluralistic. From this point of view, he wanted to be not the commander-in-chief, but also the oligarch-in-chief. And from this point of view, this also explains why the other oligarchs basically positioned themselves as they positioned. This is very important because, listen, even now, we are trying to totally deprived Ukrainian of domestic politics. And I do believe that this analytical mistake is going to be, this is true, by the way, on our side, and this is also true on the Russian side. Everybody is just saying that it's the Russia, it's the West. No, there is a lot of local interest. And even when you basically see people on the street, don't be sure that they're on the street simply because there is a foreign interest. There is a lot of negotiations coming up within basically Ukraine. And when you see people on the street of Donetsk, you don't know, is Russia negotiating with the Americans or Mr. Akhmetov is negotiating with the government? So from this point of view, I do believe that one of the major problems of the European understanding of the neighborhood is that in a certain way, we became totally non-political. And this is the major intellectual, in my view, failure of the enlargement. Because enlargement for us was just institutions, technical proceedings, go here, go there, some packaging, and basically you're not interested what is happening on the ground. Carl Schmitt, who is quite popular in Russia, not so popular in the European Union, used to say that the problem with the victorious powers is that they're losing curiosity. And I do believe that the European Union is now paying a high price of losing curiosity in what's happening on its borders. After saying this, my third point is we cannot go to business as usual. I know that especially in the business community, there is the following idea. Listen, there was a Russia-Georgia war. And then there was a heated debate again, and there was a rhetoric, and people were saying that world is not the same anymore, but the world happened to be the same. This type of a conflict is very different than the Russia-Georgia war. You cannot go back to the business as usual for many reasons, which we're not going to discuss. But one of the most important reasons is that what we are seeing, and here I very much agree with Mr. Stepich, is that the crisis in Ukraine is simply the fourth stage of the crisis of the European Union itself. We started with a financial crisis. that turned into institutional crisis, basically how we are governing the Eurozone. And then basically this was very much transformed into political and social crisis because the problem was what you're doing with the democratic countries when you try to very much deprive them of economic decision making. And now you're ending up with a geopolitical crisis, and the question is to what extent European Union can be a foreign policy actor. And here you have a different risks. One of them, totally new relations between the United States and the European Union. United States has a very low trade relations with Russia. So for the United States, it's much easier to have a tough economic and political line on Russia. On the other side, European Union is very much split between countries. And honestly speaking, even having in mind big institutions like Raiffeisen Bank, you have the fact that Russia also basically has hostages there. And from this point of view, this is a very different type of a politics within the European Union, which has nothing to do with the Ukraine. This is what's happening within the Union. And I'm going to make the last point. And my last point is that if we're going to talk about new European order, the new European order, of course, is not about enlarging European Union now, immediately. The new European order, in my view, should be based on the fact that for the last 20 years, there was 4 different projects that have been underway in Europe, and all of them being very vulnerable and in a certain way very much interdependent. One was the one that we know very well, and this is the enlargement and the transformation of the European Union. The second was, by the way, the try to establish the post-imperial Russia, because in its history, Russia was always an empire. And honestly speaking, I do believe this is very interesting. People like to talk about Crimea as the return of the Russian imperialism. It's not exactly the case. Both Soviet and the Russian imperialism have been universal. What we listen on the level of justifications from Mr. Putin, this is an expansionism of a regional ethnic state. It's not what he occupied, but with what kind of an arguments he defended his decision. It's much closer to Mr. Milosevic in 1991 than basically the Soviet style, which Soviet style was universal. It was about transforming the world. It was not about getting Crimea. The third project, by the way, which we didn't discuss at all, was the emergence of a post-Kemalist Turkey, which is also a player of its own and which is going to be part of the European order, and the European Union is going to negotiate also with it. And the third is the state building in some of the new independent states in the post-Soviet and post-Yugoslav territory. And here, of course, we're talking a lot about the failure of the post-Soviet model, but the post-Yugoslav model is not a high success too. And I do believe that the biggest problem is that this project has the capacity to destabilize each other. Under certain conditions, they can stabilize each other. Under certain conditions, basically, they can destabilize each other. And in a certain way, to be influential in the modern world, and I do believe this is the major discovery of Mr. Putin, it's not about solving problem. It's basically trying to create problems that makes you relevant. And this is very important. I do believe this is very important because this is the new game. This is where I want to stop, because European orders is not based simply on treaties. This is based on rational expectations. This is to know what the others are not going to do. And when I was in Moscow, we have been asking different people, can you tell me what is the new unthinkable? For example, if you're a journalist, can you tell me what kind of information you're going to see as so absurd that you're not going to check it? And everybody is saying, we don't know anymore. And I do believe this level of uncertainty, this total disappearances of a red line, and having this strategy of no red line policies, that is the major characteristic of the new situation. And for the European Union, this is very difficult. Because European Union can be strong, can be weak, can be nice, can be basically stupid, but we don't know how to be unpredictable. Unfortunately, unpredictability rules the world.